Hello. I'd like to start this lecture with a couple comments. First, I want to make sure that you all knew that I am neither a historian nor a theologian. My knowledge of Old Testament history is probably not much better than yours, and it's embedded in my mind as flannel graph cutouts from the 1960s from my Sunday school days. And let's face it, unless you're some professor of Old Testament history, these are not the two most exciting chapters in the Bible. So as a result, I decided that I needed to have a little fun with them. And I'll be upfront now by saying that my talk might not be 100% historically accurate. That being said, my primary goal is to show how these passages are a small part of God's great plan of redemptive history, and I pray to succeed to that end. Secondly, and I've never done this before, I'd like to dedicate this talk to our dear sister Mariah, who died very recently, but who was part of this Bible study for many years. We'll always remember her humor, her gentleness, and her wisdom. We are still sojourners in this foreign land, but Mariah is finally home. As I began to read these two chapters, I was a bit put off by the long inventories of temple objects and the long lists of names. Not a lot of material to work with, I thought, but with the aid of the handy commentaries, I began to read through these chapters and was surprised by how much depth and dimension I found. These were real people with names, or maybe nicknames, with meanings like dedicated to God and female scribe, but also humpback and talks too much. Many had names reflecting their Hebrew origins, others had adopted Babylonian names. Some of these people were leaders, some servants. I began to see them not as a list of funny-sounding names, but as a frozen moment in history, each name containing a story of its own and reflecting how they retained their identities despite their decades in exile. And one thing they had in common: even in their 70-year captivity, they might have put down roots and made new lives for their families, but their hearts remained in the land God had given their ancestors hundreds of years earlier. They had retained their identity as God's people, and they longed to return and rebuild their homeland. So when the new Persian King Cyrus proclaimed their freedom, it appears that as many as 50,000 people dropped everything and set their sights on Jerusalem. It must have been a wonderful time as the news spread, the joy becoming even greater with the realization that King Cyrus was even giving them back their sacred temple objects, bowls, plates, and other objects used in worship and sacrifice. Sadly, what was lost to the ages was the Ark of the Covenant, the symbolic presence of God among mankind. But a time of rebirth and renewal was at hand, and the people joyously gave freely out of their own purses in a capital campaign that would probably put us new lifers to shame. Now, being pre-recorded, I can't ask for a show of hands, but I wonder how many of you were part of our Bible study several years ago when we studied the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was one of those prophets who had warned the people over and over to give up their idol worship and turn back to the one true God, because their failure to do so would result in the destruction of their nation. But along with the warning, Isaiah foretold the events of Ezra and Nehemiah, actually mentioning King Cyrus by name. I remember this well because that was the passage, Isaiah 45, that I lectured on that year. I hope a few of you remember it too, because in my talk, I introduced you to a woman I called Hannah, my sister from another century. Hannah lived in Jerusalem in the year 586 BC when the Babylonians swept through the country one last time, destroying the temple and carrying off the remaining people into captivity. Like other people of her society, Hannah had not comprehended how offensive her practice of idol worship was to God and how it had led to these horrific events. In my story, Hannah told us how she, with her son and husband, somehow managed to escape capture, but lived out their lives in poverty amidst the ruins of the late, great Jerusalem. But did you remember that Hannah also had a daughter? Since I told you how I felt there was a good story behind the names on that list in chapter 2, let's hear one. Today I would like you to meet Hannah's daughter and hear what she has to say in her own words. And may I add that any similarities to my own family may or may not be fully intentional. All right. My name is Judith. Perhaps you have heard of my mother, Hannah, and know of her story. I wish I knew what happened to her. I'm grieved to say that I never saw her again since we were all taken off into captivity. The last time we were all together, I was a young wife and mother, but many years have passed, and now I have quite a story of my own to tell. Yes, I'm very old now, but while my memory is still sharp, I want to make sure you hear and learn from my life. At the time of my birth in the land of Judah, things were already going downhill. I had heard stories of King David. He was the king who loved and served God, and of his son Solomon. He built our glorious temple. Those were the glory days when God's favor was on them. The temple was a reminder that he dwelled with us, his chosen people. But that was hundreds of years ago, and since then, the kings that followed them seemed to go from bad to worse, worshiping idols, living lives of sin, and leading the rest of us down the road to destruction. The prophets warned us, but we didn't listen. But finally the day came when their words were fulfilled, and the army of the Babylonians descended upon our country. They came in waves, the first time when I was a little girl. I remember that day. My brother had just been born, and my parents were terrified. They swept through Jerusalem, plundering the temple and carrying off the best and brightest young men to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Things did quiet down for a few years until I was a teenager, and they came back for more. Again, we managed to escape the marauders, and life settled down to an uneasy new normal. I grew into womanhood and got married and had my first son. Then came the year that changed everything. I'm sure you have gone through some bad years yourselves. Maybe you're going through one right now. But I don't think your bad year can hold a candle to mine. That was the year that we were invaded one last and terrible time. It was a night I wish I could forget. We were awakened in the night by shouting and wailing. Soldiers walked the streets, ordering us out of our houses. They weren't picky anymore. This time they took everyone they could find and killed anyone they thought wasn't worth the trouble. In the confusion, we lost track of my parents and brother. I looked desperately for them in the crowds and among the dead bodies in the streets, but to no avail, and as I said, we never saw them again. And like I said, that's their story. Let me continue with mine. As we began our long walk into captivity, I looked back towards Jerusalem, or what was left of it, seeing smoke curling up from the remains of the temple. That's when the thought hit me. We, God's chosen people, had abandoned him. Now, seeing his house in flames, I wondered, has God finally abandoned us? It was a hard journey, made even harder by the fact that we had no idea what awaited us at the end. You know, we Hebrews seem to travel a lot. I was taught the stories of how our father Abraham traveled from Ur to the Promised Land, and then how our people left Egypt to escape slavery and returned to this Promised Land. Yes, it wasn't always easy for them, but in their case, at least they knew they were going home. As we trudged along through the wilderness, it dawned on me that our journey into exile was more like that of our first parents, Adam and Eve. They too rebelled against God, and they were cast out of Eden, the first temple, the place where mankind was meant to dwell with God without sin or shame. Now history has repeated itself. We just don't seem to learn, do we?